I would like to welcome you to the second episode on unity versus unification. I'm Archbishop Brian Putzier, and I am talking to you from my office here at the United Episcopal Catholic Communion. In the first episode of Unity versus Unification, we utilized some of the biblical and historical information from some of the greatest theological, religious archaeological, and religious anthropological experts. Much of this information presented to all of the major denominations and sects of Christianity, including the Church of Rome. In this episode, we will present an analysis of unification. Unification, by definition, is a consolidation of the worldwide Christian Church under a single patriarch, single canons, single rubrics, single ethics, single theology and theological training, and single day-to-day operations. In episode 1, we discussed the dichotomy of operations in the early church that existed from the death of Jesus in 33 AD to approximately 70 AD. The four main churches of the time being Antioch in 42 AD, Alexandria in 49 AD, Jerusalem in 33 AD, and Rome in 67 AD. All operated in a mostly autonomous manner with many differences in their operations. These known differences are complicated by the fact that biblical text of the early church fathers, and texts of non-Christian observers are in conflict within the context of the historical occurrences. We will list here the early disagreements on church operations that reflect the earliest forms of denominationalism, the exact same denominationalism and sectism and underlying sects that we see today. The Council of Jerusalem in 50 AD, overseen by the authority of James the Just. The attendees agreed in principle that Peter, who had issues with the teachings of Paul and the Church of the Gentiles, was declared by James and the council to no longer practice with the Gentiles. Peter was directed to practice within the context of the Jewish converts. Paul was directed to only concentrate on the Gentiles, which he was already doing. Hence, Peter practiced a large number of Jewish faith concepts, but Paul did not subscribe to presenting the Jewish faith concepts at all to the Gentiles. Hence, from the very beginning, we had two main church concepts that were born. The heated debate during the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD regarding the nature of Jesus. Was he man, God, both, or something else entirely? This disagreement over Jesus resulted in the earliest major break in the church. This was the Coptic Church breaking away from the Byzantine Church. We now had distinctly two different denominations operating under two totally separate sets of rules and leaders. During the Chaldean Council in 451 AD, the disagreement over the status of Jesus finally came to a head. The council dictates the duality of Jesus as both Godhead and manhood. The Eastern Orthodox Church accepted this valid dogma, yet the Orthodox Church of Egypt, Syria, Armenian, and Assyrian churches completely broke ranks and disavowed these findings. Hence, these churches practice a whole different theology, which was reflected in the canons, the rubrics, and the liturgies. As we can see, we are now looking at 5, 6, maybe 7 distinct church entities that are operating with their own leaders, their own canons, their own rubrics, and their own liturgies. One of the main factors that led to future disagreements within the church came from the push by many to elevate the Church of Constantinople to the same level of authority as the new seat of authority in Rome, the authority that was removed from Jerusalem. This may be a distinct statement that many believe that the apostles and subsequent bishops are equals among equals. That includes the papacy. This declaration from Constantinople led the way to the malcontent and power struggle and control of the now substantial finances of the church that culminated in the Great Schism of 1054 AD. My friends, these four main points should suffice in describing the sects of Christianity that formed immediately after the death of Jesus, with really no intent on unification from the time of Jesus' death well into the 6th century. What is the status of the denominational and sects-based church today? First, we must look at rough outline of denominations. And of course, we must understand that there may be discourse on even this incredibly simple subject. Christianity can taxonomically be divided into 6 main groups: the Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and Restorationism. More specifically, using church names easier for us to recognize: the Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Church of the East, which was the Nestorian, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, the Reformed Church, and the Anabaptists. Some of the denominations may work well together after somewhat of a dysfunctional fashion, while others simply do not play well in the sandbox. This is the reality of the world that we live in. There is much controversy over the number of sects that operate independently of each of the denominations. This may range from hundreds or even into the thousands, and this includes the independent churches. So what are the issues that strike directly against unification? The church is very confusing to the public. The churches do not agree even on the simplest of their operations. There's no agreement on the status of Jesus. Is he God? Is he spirit? Is he man? Is he a little bit of both? Is he all three? No agreement on biblical content. Context. Is the Bible errant or inerrant? Various forms of liturgical content. You go to different churches, you get different content, even within the same denominations. Various forms or lack of the sacraments. Total disagreement on the status of Rome as the parent church. Discourse over papal infallibility. Shunning those churches who work with undesirables. Seemingly corrupt practices of those churches that operate as a business. The watering down of the rubrics and liturgies in the name of secularization and modernization. Politics of conservative theology versus liberal theology. Capitalism as a church success story. Politics defines way too much of our morals, overshadowing the morals of Christianity. Dogma that is not based on biblical fact. The old adage, we think this is what Jesus wanted. Infighting to hold and maintain control of clergy. Infighting to hold and maintain control of the faithful, or to whisk them away to other organizations, not for theological or divine reasons, but to increase the business bottom line monetarily. Bad ideologies, harmful practices, rampant disregard of sex abuse, drug abuse, and financial abuse within our institutions. Secularization, the role of women in the church, the total discourse over the LGBT plus community, racism, cultural differences, ignoring diversity, training clergy as theologians rather than as practicing clergy to bring the word and the solace of the church to the people. There is no reason for clergy to be in a position of doing what theologians do. They are to research, they are to examine the text, they are to decipher the text, they are to make conceptual concepts of what they have determined, bring that to the church fathers, and it's up to the church fathers to bring that down to the practicing clergy to say, this is our dogma. Ego, power, authoritarianism, oppression, coercion, and domination. And a very important one for us as priests, the total lack of respect for the priestly promise. Our priestly promise is very simple. We are to bring the word and the solace of the church to the people and to obey our superiors. Period. Canons and rubrics that are too complex to follow in real life. There is absolutely no church in the world, none, that require hundreds of pages and attorneys in order to decipher the canons. Self-serving church members and also self-serving clergy, all the way up the chain of command. Theologians create a hypercritical spirit of culture. We, as theologians, are right, and everybody else is wrong. And when they are also practicing clergy, that becomes very critical and a big problem. Erratic church discipline. Discipline in the church today is virtually non-existent. Traditions embedded in church canons, rubrics, and liturgies that have little or no relationship to biblical fact. Tradition is great. It is the human concept of practicing something that makes them happy. But in the case of Christianity, in the case of religion, if it's not based on fact, that tradition now becomes outside of Christianity. What a lot of people would say is heretical. And obviously the most important one, which is occurring today, the blending of other faiths or non-Christian rituals into Christianity, which has been denounced from day one after the death of Christ and in the early church. This is only a small list of the issues that the church faces in the discussion of unification. This may seem insurmountable, and you personally may be right in that thinking. What would unification solve? Well, for one, consistency. That's it in a nutshell. Every priest would preach the same words every service. The parishioners would hear identically the same words of faith in every church they would attend anywhere in the Christian world. The church should be about the word of biblical text. Bottom line, most everything else in the church is fluff. It's tradition. One thing we might lose sight of, Jesus and the apostles had little or no pomp and circumstance in their ministry. They spoke on hillsides, in people's homes. They ate together in fellowship and celebrated only the simplest of practices, the Eucharist being one of those practices. Yet unification is probably a ship that may have sailed. The current thinking in theology is to pick apart every sentence and every word in the Bible, twist it to fit the needs of a particular church, mainly to support our human need for control and the uncontrolled desire to understand outside of our capability to do so. If a few main issues were listed that inherently may not allow unification, these 4 may be noteworthy. Papal infallibility. That is denounced by every church in the world with the exception of the Roman Church. Papal supremacy. Again, dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, that the Pope is the head of all Christianity. Far too many facts directly out of biblical text seem to target the administration of the church as equals among equals, even from the time of Peter, Paul, and James. The concept of Jesus and consubstantiation. There is still disagreement today on what Jesus is and what the Trinity is. And obviously that exists because of the huge number of non-Trinitarian churches that we have in our public environment today. The meaning and intent of the Eucharist. The Eucharist still to this day has never been defined well. Is it really the blood and body of Christ? Is it a conceptual concept that there's a power there when you take it, or is it just a remembrance? That may never be resolved. Jesus said it the best when asked by the apostles why he spoke in parables, as the apostles were having a terrible time understanding his words themselves. Jesus clearly stated he spoke in parables as no one could truly understand him anyways. That is something that we need to take to heart. Yet, we can reach some level of unity even if unification is out of reach. It is as simple as each church entity minding their own business, agreeing that we're going to disagree, and stop the arrogant bickering and public repression of those we're not in agreement with. The public repression of those we do not agree with must stop. A good starting point would be put a muzzle on the theological debates, bickering over interpretation, translations, syntax, and second-guessing the intent of biblical text that is over 2,000 years old, and only the authors long dead know the intent of the Spirit that drove them to record those particular words. Our church claims that the Bible and biblical text is inerrant. Maybe we should quit rewriting the text over and over and over again, and in many cases deciphering text to fit our human perception based on our languages, the difference in the languages, the difference in our cultures, from right or wrong. Unity is the working together for the common good of the church, despite all of our differences. This is simple fact, yet not the easiest practice for our human community within the church. One of the greatest problems in our churches is the breakdown of church unity. It is insidious, it is debilitating, and it is totally destructive. By what process and by whom would the process be implemented to start the church down the road in a path to unity? The Pope of the Roman Church, along with one or several of the ecumenical patriarchs of the Orthodox Church, which declare one among equals, with declarations directly that we are one holy church. Our mission is to bring the word of Christ to the people, aid those in greatest need, uplift and return the disenfranchised to the solace of the faith, return the church to serving everyone, no matter their life status, embrace the diversity with respect, and above all, end the endless rhetoric and basically egocentric adversity that is devastating the integrity of the faith. Then we all must, all of us, mainstream churches, independents, must willingly jump on board to share that mission. We must learn to recognize the strengths and the weaknesses of each organization. But we need to work together to complement one another to the benefit of the whole. We must bury our human pride and arrogance. And finally, we must embrace the fact that church is not a business. It is not a political or government entity. It is not about who is in power or control, and not an entity of extravagant financial gain. The process is not limited to the church ministry, its mission or operations. Unity must start with the understanding that seminary training of theologians, those that study, debate, or translate biblical text, must be separated from the training of the practicing clergy. These are two totally different titles within the church. There's a great need to move away from the university seminary model with its totally unrealistic costs, the issues of politics, secularization because of its binding to the U.S. government. We must get away from that. Unity in non-accredited seminaries, fully integral to a church organization, and even apprenticeship programs or training in monastic environments must be embraced as a component of unity. Accredited seminaries did not exist in the United States until the early 1900s, and even in the major universities, accreditation and the high costs were not mandatory. They became mandatory in 1944 for one reason and one reason only. And seminaries went along with it also. That was the GI Bill of 1944. We must remember the Christian church is not our church. It is not our personal church. The church is that of our Lord Jesus Christ. The Christ in the word Christian. It is his church. We should practice it as he practices it. We should practice as the apostles practice. We no longer do that in any way, shape, or form. In ending this episode, we will leave you with two biblical passages. Paul urged us to walk worthy of the calling you have received with all humility and gentleness, with patience, accepting one another in love, dignitely keep the unity of spirit with the peace that binds us. Ephesians 4. Jesus said in John 13:35, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." My friends and colleagues, unification may, through human arrogance, be virtually impossible. But unity can be made quite simple. We should embrace unity. We should work together on one mission to bring the church to the people, to bring the solace of the church to the people, to help those in the greatest need. Thank you for listening.